Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're joining us from. Thanks for being with us on our stream today for our continuing coverage of the German elections. I'm Sumi Somaskanda, and I'm sitting here today with Ant Leininger, who is an assistant professor of political science research methods at Chemnitz University of Technology. So thanks for joining us this morning.
Yeah, good morning.
So if all of you were following the German election last night, you probably had a pretty short night. I certainly did. I was over in the big studio hosting our election coverage. And I mean, you're a political scientist, so I'm sure you also didn't get that much sleep.
No, I was up. So I was in the polling station till 11, counting the votes. We do that right in the polling station in Germany, not like shipping them to somewhere like in the UK. And then I was watching the newsfeed till 2 a.m. and I figured out it's going to take a bit longer till we have the final results, so I'll just go to bed and check this morning.
Yeah, it is a pretty close election. That's going to be one of the takeaways we're going to be talking about. And that's why we brought some strong coffee here this morning to make it through the next hour with you guys. And the reason we wanted to come together is to take stock of what happened. So talk about the results, the numbers, the different colors of coalition possibilities, but also to get an idea of what it all means and what you can take away from it, what you need to know about the German elections, especially, after 16 years of Angela Merkel leading this country, what you in the world can expect from Germany going forward. So that's what we want to do together. And you might have some questions for us, some thoughts that you have, might want to share with us. You can write directly in the stream. I have my phone here, and I'm going to be checking it and taking a look at what you might be writing. So send us, again, any questions or thoughts you might have, and Arndt and I will try to take those on. First, I want to take a look at what happened. So to look at the results, because they have been kind of moving a little bit as we've been getting more of the preliminary results coming in. And this is what we have, right?
Yeah.
So we can take a look here. I mean, I guess the big story, obviously, is that the center left, the Social Democrats, came out on top there. You see them at 25.7. That's a number that was creeping up through the course of the night. Mm-hmm. And that means they ended up above Chancellor Merkel's bloc, the Conservatives, at 24.1. And then you see the other stories that we're going to be talking about, the smaller parties, the Greens and the FDP, they're respectively at 14.8 and 11.5. The far-right AFD we're going to discuss a bit, they're at 10.3. And the left party just barely making it essentially to stay in Parliament. They're coming in at 4.9%, but we can talk about the seats distribution in a bit. But that essentially will mean that they will make it back into Parliament. So let's see if we can look at the wins and losses here of how the parties did compared to the last election in 2017. So, minus 8.8% for the Conservatives. That's a pretty big loss, isn't it?
That's a massive loss, hardly seen before. And this is the first time since 2002.
So this is we also see that the Social Democrats did much better than they did in the first, in 2017, in the last election, with 5.3 points. And I mean, you would say that this was really a big success for them.
That's a big success for them, yeah, I think. The long-term development is that their potential is not 30% anymore. So I think 25% is a big success in landing in front of the CDU, being in a prime position to form the new government with their lead candidate, Olaf Schulz, as chancellor. Yeah, that's a big success for them. Yeah,
some takeaways that I wrote down that I thought were really important. The Conservatives, that we were just saying, the worst result since World War II. The political fringes, so the far left and the far right lost ground, which is interesting. And essentially, German politics are getting messier.
Well, yeah, or you could say they're getting normal in international perspective. We're seeing a fragmentation of party systems in a lot of other countries as well. The UK. The US are the only country where it's not happening. There it's happening within the parties. But Scandinavia is way ahead. They're also doing a lot of minority governments due to that since many years. And Germany is just a bit slower in that trajectory. But generally, this is where a lot of industrial societies are going, because societies are growing more diverse. And so the electorate becomes more diverse, and so will the party system.
Yeah, I would say that the Dutch and the Belgians would say this is nothing, these three-party coalitions.
Who were, I don't know, a year or more without government.
Yeah, exactly. So was there anything that you saw that surprised you from the results that we just looked at there?
Well, as I said earlier, I think the big surprise to me was how accurate the polls were this time. So kind of the surprise was the absence of a surprise in the election result compared to the polls. Because there was a lot of uncertainty around the polls before the election because of a lot of postal voters. So about every second voter cast their ballot by mail. That's a bit difficult for pollsters ahead of the election, how to deal with that. How do you take that into account if you ask people about, if the elections are next Sunday, how would you vote? And you're asking people who already voted. But they've done a good job. They're pretty accurate.
So I'm pretty curious, and I'm sure some of the people in our stream are as well. You said you were actually in a polling station counting votes. Tell us what that process is like. So you were a volunteer helping out. Tell us what that's like. You come in, you have probably some rules about what you need to follow. What was it like?
Well, so you get up at 6 a.m. You're in the polling station at 7 a.m. to prepare the whole thing. Put up these boxes where people can vote behind, get the papers ready and everything, get your voters list out to check people's identity once they're allowed to vote, which happens at 8 a.m. And then voting is open till 6 p.m. Then we closed the polling station. Particular thing here in Berlin was that we also had elections for state parliament, municipal councils, as well as a state referendum. So there was a lot of counting and voting going on, so we had long queues. Voting in some precincts carried on till 8 p.m. So in Germany, the rule is if you're in the polling station by 6 p.m., you can also vote after 6 p.m., which I think is different from the UK, where it's rejected if you don't get the ballot paper before 6 p.m. And then you do the counting, and that can take some time. But we do it right in a polling station, which is why we're usually used to having results around midnight, which was not the case this time, which was due to the large extent of postal voting. We increased postal precincts, but not sufficiently to kind of keep up with that volume of mail ballots.
It is actually pretty fast, you have to say, to get through all those votes so quickly. So that's impressive. Who do you think were the biggest winners, and putting your political scientist hat back on, the biggest winners and losers of this election?
Well, the biggest winners are, for me, the Social Democrats and the Green Party. The framing for the Green Party is a bit different at the moment, or mixed. A lot of people are talking this is a disappointment. I wouldn't see it as that. They've almost doubled their result. This is the strongest we've just seen it in the chart, right? Strongest percentage point increase, strongest increase in terms of percentage of the past vote. And personally, I think we've seen it in 2017, 2013. The same thing happened. Midterm polls looked very good for them. They didn't deliver on election day. Frankly, I think midterm election polls tell you very little about electoral potential. So I think there's little reason for the Green Party to be disappointed.
I want to bring in a question that we have already on our stream from Namri, who's asking, how will you collect the money you need for all the problems we are facing? That's a pretty good question.
I guess he means money for the government to kind of solve climate issues and so on. Yeah, I mean, that is not really my field, but I can say one thing about it is that was a question that was posed in the TV debates, with free TV debates, which were not duels, but we have three candidates, right, of the Social Democrats, the Conservatives, and the Green Party, because going into the campaign, they were on par with the other two parties. And the way that the question with climate change was always phrased was, how are we going to finance the costs? Right. Which is a bit ludicrous, given the scientific evidence and all these studies showing us that doing nothing will be much more costly than doing something against it. But this is the state of play currently in Germany, that we're realized it's a problem, but we haven't yet fully realized the full extent of the problem, and hence these kind of questions.
Okay, well, I want to ask you about something that a lot of people are trying to wrap their mind around this morning, which is what are the possible coalitions? But before we talk about it, I think we have a clip of after the election results started coming in last night, essentially all of the party leaders saying, well, now we have a mandate to govern, or at least to be a part of the government. So let's bring up that clip if we can.
This is a clear message from the voters. That means that climate policy must be in the central of a new German government.
And this is a mandate given to us. The Christian Democratic Union have received a clear mandate.
There's a clear mandate for the Green Party
to ensure that everything we said in the election campaign, all of our proposals be implemented. And the climate legislation in this country also means that we must act quickly. And it would seem that for the first time we are going to have a German government with three coalition partners.
So everyone has a mandate, essentially, to either lead the government or be part of the next government. looking at that, I mean, who actually has the possibility of leading the next government?
All right, first what you need to understand is that we have a proportional representation system, so no party has an absolute majority in parliament. It only happened a single time, and even then Konrad Adenauer's CDU went into a coalition government. And we did have coalitions led by the second-placed party in terms of the vote share, right? So basically, in such a system, everybody has a sense of a mandate and could form a winning coalition, and now everybody wants to get into the position to kind of negotiate that coalition and be in that coalition.
What is most likely, though, right now? I mean, we have so many, and I know it's confusing for people because we talk about these coalition possibilities in terms of like colors of flags. So a Jamaica coalition, it's probably a question people have. What is that? Or the traffic light coalition. Put into context for us, what is the most likely, from your perspective right now, the most likely possibility of the next German government?
Well, yeah, in Germany we like to call our coalitions after flags, right?
Yeah.
So if you watch Big Bang Theory, Sheldon Cooper would enjoy that. So Jamaica, as you mentioned, the flags of Jamaica are black, green and yellow. And so that also represents the colors of the parties. Yeah. This is one option, so that would be Conservatives, Green Party and Liberals. And the other option that's on the table is the traffic light coalition, which has the colors of a traffic light. So that would be led by the Social Democrats. There would be the Greens, and there would be the Liberal Party. And there's also a third option, which would just be a continuation of the Grand Coalition. Not as grand as it used to be, but that's already the case now. But with a different leader, right? Because the SPD has more seats than the CDU, so they would switch kind of the driving seat, so to speak. I'm not sure that's going to happen. So it's a question whether one of these three-way coalitions will happen. There's other possibilities, but those don't have a numerical majority in parliament. So, for instance, we could have a left bloc of Social Democrats, Green Party, and Left Party. Yeah. But they're short a couple of seats of a parliamentary majority. So that's not going to happen. So it's essentially, does the CDU stay in power together with the Liberals and the Green Party, which are currently out of government? Or is the SPD getting into government together with those two parties again? And that would be a complete overhaul of the government. And we'll see what's going to happen.
There's so many possibilities. It's going to be confusing, of course, and also it's going to take some time. Let's bring in one of our correspondents now, our chief political editor, because she's been following the Conservatives. Michaela Küffner is there with us. Good morning, Michaela. Arndt and I here were saying we didn't sleep very much. I think you must have slept probably the least of all of us. You're back and at it bright and early this morning. And, you know, the Conservatives waking up essentially to some pretty big losses this morning. So what have you been hearing from people you've been talking to in the parties about how they're feeling about this election?
Well, just a short while ago, we saw actually a whole long line of limousines arriving here, and member after member of the party executive coming out and restating the claim staked out by Armin Laschet, the Chancellor candidate of the CDU-CSU, already last night, that they see themselves within their rights to strive to form yet another governing coalition. Not just as a mathematical possibility, despite the fact that this has been a historic loss for the Conservative camp. There was one notable exception, though. The state premier of Saxony, Michael Kretschmer, he, by the skin of his teeth, won against the far-right AfD party in state elections. He knows how tough it is to position yourself against the far-right and to actually win elections. And he was very concerned about the party profile, saying literally we cannot continue as usual, saying that some tough questions needed to be asked. And my sense is that those tough questions won't be asked behind closed doors just yet. Everybody is fixated on that idea. How can we pull this off? How can we stay in power and convince those smaller parties, the Greens and the Free Democrats, to join a coalition with them, as opposed to the clear winner of the night, Social Democrat leader Olaf Schulz?
I'm going to ask our political scientists to put that into context for us. I mean, we're talking about essentially the party that came in second looking to form a government. That is not unprecedented in Germany, but is it unusual?
It's been unusual in the past, but it's not unusual in general in Germany. I mean, for a lot of time, of most of the history of the Federal Republic, it was basically the Liberals deciding who would be chancellor by either coalescing with the CDU, CSU, or with the SPD. And whenever governments changed before the 2000s, that was because the FDP switched allegiance.
Michele, coming back to you and to look at how the Conservatives actually did, I mean, what do you chalk this up to? The fact that, yes, they're not out of the picture. Of course, they could still form a government. Armin Laschet could still be the next chancellor. But we're talking about more than 8 percentage points less than the last election. What do you think what did you think that's a result of?
Well, I just want to add to that, actually, ironically, in the past, the examples where the party who came second formed a government, it actually was the Social Democrats. That was in the late 60s and early 70s. So there's only 2 examples of that here in Germany, and they were then Social Democrat-led. So they're kind of even on examples there. Well, Armin Laschet explained what is a setback quite clearly, not just for his party, but also for him personally, saying, well, the departure of Angela Merkel, we knew it was always going to be difficult. Well, yes, they did. At the same time, he did make quite a few mistakes during that campaign. He also admits to that, although he doesn't stress it as much as Annalena Baerbock does, who kind of went down the list of her own personal failings when she stood before her party. And but this is something Armin Laschet can't simply pin on Angela Merkel. Angela Merkel tried to stay out of the race, then realized that things were getting desperate, and then only really stood by his side over those last 3 weeks of the campaign. That might have been too little, too late. But when you look at the personal ratings and the reason why people voted for a party, well, there Olaf Schulz, the Social Democrat, saw 48% of people polled saying they voted SPD because of him. In the case of Armin Laschet, it was only 10%. So he was a weak candidate. There's a lot of data really proving that. Also, when you went to talk to people on the streets, many still would have preferred the Bavarian state premier Markus Söder as a candidate. This was decided by the upper levels of the party. It was not a grassroots decision. Questions about that will certainly be asked as soon as the real power option is off the table, if that happens. If it doesn't, if the CDU manages to pull this together, there is this element of institutionalized party discipline that will keep the shop together. As soon as that power option evaporates, the knives will be out for Armin Laschet, that is for sure.
Michele, just to follow up on that, how likely do you think it is that the Conservatives, I'm asking you to look in your crystal ball here, but that they could form a government with the Greens and with the Liberals? I mean, is that really a good possibility at this point?
It is a viable possibility. After all, this is what the option on the table was in 2017. Only back then, the CDU was the strongest party. It really is down to the Greens, how far into Conservative territory they will be willing to stretch. We saw the Social Democrats and the Greens kind of flirting across the table, Olaf Scholz and Annalena Baerbock, ahead of these elections. What's unusual is that we didn't have these coalition declarations right out before people went to the polls. So tactical voting was a lot more difficult for voters this time around. I really can't tell you right now. I think it really is up to the Greens, and the small parties are in a very good bargaining position right now, that has to be said. So whoever is Chancellor in the end will have given up a lot of political territory to get there. I wouldn't really want to predict at this moment in time. Don't underestimate Armin Laschet as a negotiator and a coalition former.
Yeah, that's a really important message. Okay, thanks, Michele. We're going to come back to you a little bit later. We're going to continue talking about coalition possibilities here and some of the bigger picture questions, and come back to you a little bit later. We actually have some questions that have come through now also from our viewers on our stream. So I want to put some of those to you to clear up some questions. So thank you for the questions, first of all. One question from Harjit, who's asking here, my question is that could a red-red-green coalition, so this is the Social Democrats, the far left party, and the Green Party, could they rule with minority, so not reaching enough essentially to have a majority government?
No, I don't think so. I don't see the other party supporting that minority government. I mean, at least for the budget vote, you'd need another party to get the parliamentary majority. You can get a chancellor in the third round of voting in parliament with a relative majority. I think it's pretty unlikely that that's going to happen. Germany loves stability, what they think is stability, and they think that minority governments are unstable, and so this is not very popular with voters. This is not very popular with party elites, because at the national level we've little to no, well, we've got no experience. We've got very little experience at the state level. So I think we're not there yet to explore these possibilities, even if they hold promise.
Even if other countries also lead with minority governments, it's just not something that Germans are saying really like, because it doesn't provide the stability for decision making.
Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of common prejudice. I don't really think that majoritarian governments are more stable than minority governments. I mean, look at the outgoing government. There've been so many quarrels, so many near break points in the past years. It's not really a great example of how stable. They made it through the full 4 years, but there were a lot of points where you thought, oh, the government might break over this. On the other side, minority governments would kind of offer the possibility, if you as a government don't have that natural majority in parliament, well, you got to negotiate a bit more. You got to argue in public for your issues, and this could also be positive for the public debate to not just rely on your coalition, ram issues through parliament, but really always needing to seek that parliamentary majority, and that also comes through getting the public behind you, behind your proposals.
Yeah. Well, that certainly is something that, as you said, the parties here in Germany don't seem keen to do. But
no.
I want to ask you some questions that have come in on some of the smaller parties. And we have a question here from Zachary Klein, who's asking, what does the election result mean for the far-right AfD? Did they make gains in the regional elections? Are they isolated or still rising? So that's a great question, because I mentioned it looks on the national level like the fringes lost ground.
Well, there's a regional picture in some areas, like for instance Saxony. If you look at the constituencies there, it's a light blue map, which is the color of the party. In other areas, they lost a bit, or strongly. In Berlin, they almost halved their vote share. Nationally, they've come in at a bit less than they had last time. If you recall 2017, in the polls, pollsters usually ask German citizens about the top 2 issues they see in the campaign. Yeah. And about 50% said one of the top 2 issues was migration or foreigners, however you want to call it. This is down to 13% this election. So our thinking was, back then they profited a lot from this, but now, despite their core issue not being a big issue, they still came in at close to what they had last time.
So, do you think they reached their peak?
I think they reached their peak, but they, on the other hand, seem to have a very stable electorate that still votes for them, even if the core issues of the party are not at the heart of the campaigns. Particularly
in the east of the country. We're just looking at those results up there again. And another question, thanks for putting up those results to our producer, Stacey. A question is, the left is still in the parliament, even though they've just got 4.9%. This is going to get complicated, but explain to our viewers in the stream why that's possible.
Yeah, so the German electoral system is a bit like German grammar, right? So there's very strict rules, and then there's a lot of exceptions. And the one exception we have here is they failed the so-called 5% threshold, meaning you need to have 5% nationally to get your party lists into parliament, unless you win 3 constituency seats, which Die Linke did. They won one in Berlin-Lichtenberg, one in Berlin-Treptow-Köpenick, and the other one was Leipzig 2. And so that means also their party lists will provide seats in parliament.
Okay, well, that was a great answer. Actually, far less complicated than I thought it was going to be. We're going to talk now about the big winners of the evening, or one of the winners, the Social Democrats. I think we have our correspondent, Nina Haase, up with us. She was, there she is. Hi, Nina. Also had a very short night. Nina was with the Social Democrats late into the night. Nina, how are people, first of all, feeling there this morning? Still pretty victorious?
Yes. Pretty victorious. They're completely calm. They're excited, and they're looking forward, obviously, to sending out this message that they won 3 elections, because that is the message that they have been trying to sell since last night. I was here when the first exit polls came in, and there were 3 rounds of applause, because the first exit poll, of course, for the federal election saw the SPD leading the polls, and then came the results from the 2 state elections, from Mecklenburg-Vorpommern and from Berlin. And here again, those posts of state leader also went to 2 social democratic women. So a lot of reasons for the SPD to celebrate, and they're continuing to do so. But of course, Olaf Schulz, in his typical Olaf Schulz way, has already said now it's time to get to work.
Yeah, indeed. That is, he's been called the Schulzomat, so that he has this kind of robotic approach to politics. I want to ask you both about Olaf Schulz and why he's popular. I think we have a clip of him speaking last night after the election results came in, at least the first exit poll results came in, and it was clear that the Social Democrats did pretty well. Let's see if we can pull up that clip now.
We're a pragmatic party. We know how to govern. We're an optimistic party that wants to push for a better future for all of us in Germany. But I think we've also shown that we have what it takes to govern a country, the ability to join ranks and have everyone support us. And the fact that that was the case is something I want to say thank you to all of you for.
Nina, I think if we still have Nina with us, I hope. Maybe she's gone for now, but yeah, there she is. Hey, Nina. Before I ask Arndt about it, I want to ask you about Olaf Schulz. It seemed to be his message throughout the campaign that he was able to bring this broad coalition of voters, perhaps people who hadn't really thought about voting for the Social Democrats before. How did he manage to do that?
It is interesting to me, and of course we'll be talking about this a lot over the next coming weeks, but I think you do have to mention once at least that there is a similar effect to what we saw with the Conservatives and Angela Merkel, that lots of people voted for the Conservatives even though they are not necessarily, strictly speaking, traditionally conservative. And it is the same with the Chancellor candidate of the SPD. A lot of people just voted for him and not necessarily for the party. And in last night's election, some 48% of Germans actually said, without Olaf Scholz, I wouldn't have given my vote to the SPD. So there is a big, big appeal where he's exuding that feeling of, yes, we can provide the necessary change that is needed, because that is something that Germans have been calling for as well. We do need some change in our government. And yet he's providing an amount of stability that doesn't scare Germans, if you want to put it that way.
And how unusual is that? I mean, Germans, do they usually vote for, this popular chancellor candidate, or really their parties? Is it unusual that so many people kind of decided that they wanted to cast their ballot for this person?
Well, I think the candidates are important, but ever since Willy Brandt, I think the big personalities haven't really caught the voters' attention, but it's more people like Olaf Schulz. So a friend who's a Social Democrat sent me a last-minute audio message from Schulz to his voters, and I almost fell asleep listening to it. But Germans love it. He projects this calmness, this stability, a kind of common sense. In a sense, I think a lot of voters see him as the rightful heir to Angela Merkel and not gaffe-prone Armin Laschet.
Yeah, Nina, certainly we saw Olaf Scholz doing Angela Merkel's characteristic, diamond. We saw that in the lead-up in the campaign. So give us an idea of exactly what happens next now for Olaf Scholz. I mean, now they get into coalition negotiations. He surely wants to be chancellor. So what are their next steps?
Well, the SPD, I think, had been hoping that the Left Party would get enough support to make this scenario of a coalition between the Social Democrats, the Greens and the Left Party something of a threat. Because now they don't have that scenario because the Left performed so poorly in the election. And now they are really dependent on what Christian Lindner from the business-friendly FDP is going to say about coalition options and what to put into the potential coalition treaty, and what the Greens are going to say as well, because these two parties are, of course, the kingmakers. And Christian Lindner has already made it very clear that he wants to go with the Conservatives. So, that leaves Olaf Scholz with a bit of a smaller leverage than he had hoped for. But the other big important thing is that the SPD managed to continue showing that unity that they managed to show in over the last year since Olaf Scholz was nominated Chancellor candidate last August last year. They have really joined ranks behind him, and the party leaders took a back seat and they really let their candidate perform, and I think that contributed tremendously to the party's success last night. So whether that unity will persist when it comes to the tricky details of who to govern with and how many compromises the SPD is going to risk making, I mean, that is going to be extremely interesting to watch.
Yeah, I wish we could all be a fly on the wall in some of those coalition negotiations that are going to be starting now. Nina, thank you. We're going to talk to you, perhaps check in with you a little bit later. We'll let you go get some more coffee and talk to some more people there at the Social Democrats headquarters. Thanks, Nina. What did you make of what Nina said about how that unity within the Social Democrats, Olaf Schulz's ability to bring in all of these voters who might not traditionally vote for the center left, how that might translate into coalition negotiations?
Well, first of all, I think your correspondent made a very important point that we don't talk enough about. We talk a lot about the candidates, and obviously Olaf Schulz seems to be the more reliable candidate of the two, of Armin Laschet and him. But the other thing, I think, is you have that reliable candidate with the SPD, and you have a party that's united behind him. I mean, think a bit back, right? There was this internal leadership contest in the Social Democrats that Scholz actually lost against two fringe figures from the party's left, right? But now these two people and all the party united behind Scholz. The CDU and the CSU, that's something you should know, right? It's actually a coalition of two parties. The CDU only competes 15 of 16 states in Germany, and there's the CSU in Bavaria. So it's not just a party in different states, it's actually two separate parties, but makes it increasingly difficult. And it was a nightmarish, long night negotiations within the party to get the chancellor candidate. So the candidate doesn't seem strong, and voters see that he's got a party behind him that is not at all united. So how should he be able to deliver kind of the stable government that the Germans expect? So I think it's not sufficient to just pounce on Armin Laschet. I think the other thing is just internal divisions within the CDU and constant sniping from the CSU.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. We have to talk about the other winners of the night, or at least one of the other winners, the Green Party, because they came out with, I think this really is kind of the tale of two nights for the Greens, because on the one hand, they had hoped to do much better than they actually performed, and on the other hand, they got their best result, really. So, I mean, how do you see how the Greens did last night?
Well, my perspective is primarily informed by the results last time, plus some statistical work of my own, where I've kind of tried to look at the long-term trajectories of the parties and what kind of the long-term potential is. And we actually forecasted the Green Party at 14.3% in June this year. And my co-authors were like anxious, this is never going to work, because they're currently at 20 when we did this, and now they're at 14 something,
so
right?
Why did you see 14%? How did you forecast that when no one else was forecasting that?
Well, we kind of looked at the long-term trends from election to election. We also looked at state elections, which are in between national elections, right? So they're dispersed over the electoral calendar. And I think they're much better able to give you an idea of actual voting rather than these voting intentions. Personally, I think these midterm vote intention polls, so we call it the Sonntagsfrage, the Sunday question, because we vote on Sunday, and the question is, if the elections were next Sunday, how would you vote? Yeah. At a point in time where most people don't talk about politics, don't think about politics, we've come to a point where a lot of people have realized climate change is a problem, and the first party that comes to mind is the Green Party. Yeah. So a lot of people say Green Party, but not anymore. When the campaign begins, they begin to think about politics, and then they reorient themselves. So I think this was foreseeable, actually, and there shouldn't be too much disappointment in the Green Party about this result.
Let's see how much disappointment there is. I think we have our correspondent, Julia Saudelli, who was with the Greens all of last night, especially those results came in, and she's with us in Berlin this morning. Hi, Julia. You've been speaking to a lot of Green Party members, also following the Greens throughout the summer as well, through the ups and downs of this election campaign. So tell us, how are the Greens feeling this morning? Are they still happy with the result or disappointed?
Well, all in all, they're pretty satisfied with it. Last night, at the end of their election night event, they kept on partying for hours. They were on the dance floor having fun. Annalena Baerbock, the chancellor candidate for the Greens, said there is some disappointment, and other members of the party have confirmed that to me. Obviously, they had wanted to do better, especially at the beginning of the campaign. They'd hoped that they could really maybe be able to win this election a few months ago, and that clearly didn't pan out as they had hoped. But they're still quite satisfied. You know, if we we consider that they've increased their voter share, that they are now the third party in parliament, it's still a pretty good result for them. And what they're interpreting from this result is we now have a mandate from the German voters to bring forward a government that is strong on climate change, and they want to be a big player in the next government.
Julia, I want to ask you about the Greens Chancellor candidate, Annalena Baerbock, because there was a lot of interest internationally in her as well, because this is a young woman who brought a lot of passion to the stage and made climate change front and center of the Greens campaign, of course, but also put it really on the agenda, along with all of the many protesters that we've seen in Berlin over the last few years with Fridays for Future, really put it on the agenda here in Germany. So was she, would you say, the right candidate for the Greens going into this? And what influence will she have going forward in these coalition negotiations?
Well, when she was first nominated as chancellor candidate, there was huge media attention. The polls really went up drastically for the Greens, so there seemed to be a lot of enthusiasm about her being the candidate. And she does fit the perfect picture. She's a young woman. She has international experience. She has been with the party for a while now. She has been a member of parliament for 8 years. And she was also quite involved in the previous government negotiations 4 years ago, when it looked like the Greens might be part of the government coalition. So there was a lot of attention put on her, but that also meant that there was a lot of scrutiny, a lot of pressure put on her, and the Greens weren't probably really used to being put under the limelight that much, because it was the first time they put forward a chancellor candidate, and they were maybe not really prepared, and she was maybe also not really prepared. She herself yesterday again said that she did make some mistakes in the campaign and that she was sorry for that. So it's going to be interesting to see how it evolves, the relationship between her and her party co-leader Robert Habeck in the upcoming coalition negotiations. They say they're going to continue to work together as they've done for the past few years since they've become party co-leaders, and it's going to be an interesting dynamic to watch.
Yeah, definitely going to be interesting to see, Julia, also how much green there is in the next government when that does take shape. So thanks, Julia. We'll talk to you a bit later. And Arndt, I want to ask you also about the Greens and coalition negotiations. Something that we saw is that if you looked at a lot of the surveys of voters and voter attitudes before the election started, a lot of people did seem to think that climate change was a big issue, something that they thought should be addressed. And something we've all been talking about is the Greens did end up at around 14%, as you said. So there seems to be this dissonance between people thinking climate change is very important, but not believing that the Greens are the right party to lead the government. How do you explain that?
Well, the Green Party certainly has what we call the issue ownership of climate change and environment, so that means most people think they're the most competent there. And it's been a big issue, so if you think this is an important issue as a voter, and if you think this party has most competence, this makes you more likely to vote for that party, and I think this is what we've seen happened. But this does not mean that this automatically translates to a 40% say climate change is one of the top 2 issues, that 40% will vote for that party. I think what happened is that they realize it's a problem, but they're hoping maybe kind of what Schulz was trying to do, what the SPD was trying to do is kind of portray a middle ground. We take the problem seriously, but our way to kind of solve the problem is not as ambitious or won't mean as many changes to your lifestyle as you might think the Greens would. And I think this is something that happened there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That they kept portraying the Greens as a party that's trying to take away your meat and your cars and your diesel cars. And I mean, it had a little bit of the element of the culture wars that we've seen in other countries, just not to the same extent, right?
No, not to the same extent. There's still Germany, and we're a bit more boring than other countries.
Boring is good sometimes.
It is good in politics sometimes if you compare it to the UK or the US or a bunch of other countries, yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Well, you also study voters, voter turnout, youth in politics, economic voting. So I do want to talk about German voters as well, but I have a pretty nerdy question that's coming in our stream, and I really appreciate the nerdy aspect of our viewers in our stream. So I'm going to put this question to you. What would the SSW's influence be? Will Schleswig-Holstein gain independence? I mean, I have to take like 5 steps back here to explain half of that, but Schleswig-Holstein is a state in northern Germany, and the question is about the SSW. I'm going to let you explain.
Yeah, so this is a very nerdy question indeed, yeah. So the party that person was talking about is a party of a Danish minority in Schleswig-Holstein. So Schleswig-Holstein is the northernmost state, it borders Denmark. And because it's a party of a national minority, here's the thing about the strict rules of our electoral system and all the exceptions again. The other exception with the 5% threshold is that if you're a party of a national minority, this threshold does not apply to you. And this party, for the first time since a very long time, put up a party list again in that state. They garnered 2% of the vote in that state, and that's sufficient for a single seat in German parliament. We'll see what they'll get out of it. Usually in Schleswig-Holstein, they did coalitions with the SPD, and in one case, they were even the deciding vote. So they might gonna use that to kind of join the party group, or at least cooperate to get something out for them, for their voters in Schleswig-Holstein.
Yeah, that was just a tiny piece of the puzzle, and I'm so impressed by your viewers for asking that question. So thank you for that question. I want to ask you a bit about voters, because there was a lot of interest in turnout, who's voting. And if you looked at some of the numbers that we saw last night, I brought this number with us. There were nearly 60% of the eligible voters in Germany were over the age of 50, which means the voters here in Germany really skew older, the people who are registered and have the ability to vote, eligible to vote. What does that mean for the way elections happen here in Germany, what the outcomes are that we actually end up seeing?
Well, in terms of policy, it means that pensions will always be a big topic, because that's close to the heart of old people, obviously. In terms of the development of the party system, it's not as easy to say. Obviously, you get a bit more conservative as you age, so more prone to vote for the big parties. But on the other hand, these people are still the ones that grew up with the opposing parties, CDU, SPD. These are the two blocks that everything revolves around. But these core cohorts of these parties, they're also dying, right? And the 68ers, Green Party voters, or people who got politicized in the 80s with the Green Party, they're now growing older, growing into these electorates. So it's not that entirely clear who's going to profit from it. And it doesn't mean that one party has a subscription on governing because they're going to capture the older vote.
Okay, so older voter doesn't mean necessarily that they're going to vote conservative. You could still see these shifting patterns.
Yeah, there's two things. There's an aging process, right, which changes you personally.
Yeah.
But then it's also a cohort thing, right, that certain cohorts just get older, but most of them stick with their past vote choices. And the cohorts that come after them are just numerically less and are much more flexible, so they have much less party identifications. This is what you saw in the result last night, right? So one of the polls that they've done was looking at that by age groups, right? And among the youngest cohorts, FDP and the Green Party, which are two very different parties,
yeah,
right, were at the top two.
Yeah, how do you explain that? So the FDP, again, for people who are not familiar with this party, this is the Free Democrats. They're the business-friendly party. And when you look at their attitude towards spending, it's a very strict budget and a very strict fiscal policy compared to the Greens, who want to spend 500 billion euros over the next 10 years to finance all that's needed, as they say, to address climate change. I mean, how do you have voters, young voters, going towards these two parties that seem to be pretty different?
Well, when you think about party competition, it often helps to think about economic issues and cultural issues. So on cultural issues, Green Party and Liberals are not that different and should appeal to young people who tend to be more liberal than older voters, right?
Also, first-time voters, just to interject there, first-time voters, a lot of them went for the Free Democrats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, this is their first time they're asked to cast their ballot, and so they have no past orientation, what they voted in the past, so they're very flexible. It doesn't mean that all of them will vote the FDP again or the Green Party next time. It's just that these two parties captured their attention. I think one part was certainly climate change for a lot of young people to vote for the Green Party. But I think there's also other young people who know that their schools are in a very bad shape. They still don't have Wi-Fi in their schools and stuff, no tablets and so on. And the FDP campaigned on modernization, and that might have appealed.
That's a really interesting point, and I think maybe for some of our viewers interesting too, because if you look at voter migration, so people who voted for one party last time and voted for a different party this time. I mean, I covered the US election last year, and there you see such deep polarization. If you vote for the Democrats, there's no way you would consider voting for the Republicans. And you see something similar because of the type of political system, first past the post in the UK as well. And yet here, I mean, I don't know, is this good for democracy, would you say, that you see voters able to switch their party alliances?
Well, it's certainly good for democracy, because then you always have this viable prospect of the opposition party being able to win the election, woo over voters. rather than trying to take electoral measures like in the US to keep the supporters of the other party from voting. So it's much more centered here on winning the election, winning voters' minds. Nobody would question the validity of last night's result. So this is a good thing. I mean, you can't always, if you're a Politico, you can't always comprehend how somebody can go from left party to AfD or other way around. I mean, it's also, these statistics are really difficult to do, right? We also have how many people died that voted this and that party last time, and where did the first-time voters go and so on. So it's difficult. I wouldn't put too much in the numbers, especially if you're like 50,000 people going from that party to that party. I think the general trends between the major parties, like, that's fairly accurate, but I wouldn't put too much in these voter transition numbers.
Yeah, I mean, they're all parties rather of the center, right? They're not, these small parties. We're talking about voters moving between these parties of the center. But I am curious to ask, you can really geek out on some of these numbers that come out in the polls of, what voter voted for this last time and was this age. So was there anything that came out in terms of how voters cast their ballots that surprised you, where you said, wow, I did not expect that?
Well, I certainly didn't expect the good result of the FDP for young voters, because it's a party full of middle-aged to older men, which, I mean, I didn't see the age-gender breakdown, so maybe this is a lot of young men voting for the party. So I didn't see many obvious appeals there. But on the other hand, young voters are very flexible in terms of who they vote for, and such things can happen.
As you said, Germans seem to like stability a lot. As Michaela Küffner, our chief political editor, has said often in this election season, stability is sexy in Germany. But at the same time, you didn't see any parties really take a stance that was anti-Angela Merkel, anti-everything she did over the last 16 years. To some grade, it seemed that all the parties did pick up much of her legacy in what she did. So what does that tell us, essentially?
Well, she was very popular in all political camps, so you don't want to attack a person that's popular among your own supporters. I think the reason why she's popular among German voters is that, I mean, especially in the past years, just to mention Donald Trump or Boris Johnson, as kind of backdrop, she just looks like a very decent person. I mean, there might be some flaws about how she handled certain things while being in government, but on a personal level, German voters kind of like this bit more dull character, down to earth, not very exuberant character. And apart from that, I think she had a fine character, and voters like that. And so there's no point in kind of taking any attacks at Merkel. Also, and then the other thing is she was totally outside of the campaign until kind of last week with some appearances. I mean, that's it. So she wasn't really part of the campaign, actually.
Yeah, then she finally came in the end. We're looking at some pictures of her there and the many world leaders that she had to work with. She really is a mainstay on the world stage as well. I mentioned Michaela Küffner, so I feel like I should bring her in because I quoted her. I think she's Michaela, I'm just quoting you here as your statement that stability is sexy in Germany. And we've been looking at some pictures of Angela Merkel, and I asked Arndt this question. I'll ask you as well. I mean, it didn't really seem like anyone was willing to say, I am going to run a campaign that's completely anti-Angela Merkel, because she had enough of her legacy that seemed to resonate a lot with German voters.
Yes, people, even her critics actually, see her historical achievements, particularly as a crisis manager, also through the financial and the debt crisis, holding Europe together, and someone who builds consensus. And that is something that Germans perceive as stability, which is a very different take on stability than, and you just mentioned it briefly in your discussion, than Britain or the United States, where the election systems are built on a winner-takes-it-all mentality, which also translates into policy making. Here in Germany, the focus of the election system is very much on finding a majority, on finding common ground, and particularly on proportionality. That's why this election system is so difficult. The aim is to have the proportional votes represented in parliament and also in the leadership of the country. Totally different from the US, where it's a winner-takes-it-all mentality. And Angela Merkel also stands for that. She repeated time and time again that finding compromise shouldn't be given a bad name in politics, that she believed in that, and that also is very much part of the German political culture, which also leaves us where we are right now, the post-Merkel era is beginning with big question marks over how this future coalition will look like, but underpinned by a Merkel stability mentality, which Olaf Schulz, also from the Social Democrats, successfully played on in his election campaign. So Angela Merkel may be gone soon, but her style of politics has certainly shaped the political landscape. We're seeing that right now.
Yeah, Arndt, I'll ask you that as well. I mean, how do you think Angela Merkel has changed the political landscape here in Germany?
Not sure whether she changed it that
I'll
much.
start with the criticism. Right.
We'll come back to you in just a second, Michael. I'm just going to get Arndt's opinion on this and ask you the same thing.
I'm not sure how much she changed the landscape. I think she kind of put it in ice. I mean, we had 16 years of continued government of the CDU, not any major parties making any inroads, and there was no election with Angela Merkel at the helm after 2005 where we thought, well, now she might go. Right, so there's not really a lot of change, but a lot of stability. Now that she left, a lot more is in flux.
Yeah, do you agree with that, Michaela?
I agree with that to a certain degree because, yes, it is a complete game changer. The absence of Angela Merkel actually releases her own party into listening to different voices. In the past, she was managed to lead the party, some argue so far to the left, because she was this overarching political figure and there was no real internal debate whether that's the right direction to go. Everybody just followed her lead. At the same time, critics actually charge her with having created a political monster here in Germany, with having made it possible for a party like the far-right AfD to actually rise. And that was through the 2015 migration crisis. The far-right AfD was actually already on the way out. And it was her open arms policy that raised this whole debate that actually left to a sense of loss of control, which allowed for a right wing to rise once again, which is now partly being observed by national intelligence over concerns that it may be against the democratic fabric of Germany itself. So that's the criticism. And she's also someone who didn't lead in the sense that she had a vision, said this is where we need to be in 3 years' time, and then aligned everything to make that happen. She listened very closely to the sentiment in the population. This is something she actually ironically learned from a Social Democrat study 2 decades ago. And that's also why she was so in touch with the public sentiment. She had the polling done and listened very closely how far she could push Germans so they didn't leave their own comfort zone. And that is also the criticism of where Angela Merkel left Germany, and that's also where the big sense of departure comes even from within her own party.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Michaela, and it brings us exactly in our last kind of 10 minutes or so to what I wanted to talk about, which is where this leaves Germany in the world. So, Arndt, I mean, you were just nodding at what Michaela was saying there. I mean, Angela Merkel, as Michaela just said, was criticized for not really having a vision for the future of the country. So where did she really leave Germany? What can we expect going forward?
Oh, that all depends on who will the chancellor be.
Yeah.
So it's very difficult to say. I think both parties will more or less follow similar lines in foreign policy and engaging with European partners. I mean, we have a big all-party consensus, apart from the AfD in Germany, on European integration. And the FDP maybe is a bit an outlier in the Democratic Party spectrum in terms of being a bit more Eurosceptic. But generally, there's an agreement that it works better to work together in Europe. So I'm not sure whether that's that decisive. There are other issues.
Okay, so not that decisive. Michaela, you know, if you look at just what the candidates have promised and what's on their list of to-dos going forward, updating digital infrastructure, combating climate change, updating bricks and mortar infrastructure as well, education, so many of these big questions about the future. You know, where is Germany headed? Is it ready for making that transition and moving to the future?
It's a real question whether it's ready for it. It will have to do it. I'm actually looking at an election poster here where from the Greens, which says trains, schools, the internet, simply a country that works, that functions. And there has been a lot of international criticism as well of Germany that it failed to invest, that there was a focus on the black zero, on not taking on any extra debt. And I just want to remind us that Angela Merkel didn't fulfill her own priority list of things to tackle. She very early on in her 16 years at the helm of Germany identified digitalization and climate as the huge global challenges that needed urgent action. And on climate, we saw a constitutional court ruling this summer basically saying that the climate policy of the Merkel government was not enough to safeguard the rights of the younger generation and the future generations. So she failed to meet legal commitments to tackling climate, and digitization is actually in itself, it speaks for itself really. Germany has missed the boat on that. It is doing very poorly in European and OECD comparison, and everybody actually catching a train these days will see that despite Corona, they are often late, they're full. So Germany is not living up to its own image abroad at this moment in time. Both big parties that could form a government, Angela Merkel's party and the SPD, say they want to tackle this. So there is a sense of departure, of having to get ready for the future. And coalition talks will show us whether this will actually translate into action.
Yeah, Germany has to move forward whether it wants to or not, as you said, Michaela. We're going to let you go. Thank you so much. Always good to talk to you. And we'll let you go and cover those coalition negotiations as they start there in the government quarter. So thanks, Michaela. And Arndt, we have just a few minutes left here on our stream. So give us an idea. What are you, as a political scientist, someone who watches the way that governments form and the way that voters react, what are you looking for in these coming weeks of how the coalition negotiations start?
Well, all the parties will first hold initial talks to kind of sketch out common grounds and see whether they want to enter into more formal negotiations. The two options, we've discussed them, are the so-called traffic light coalition of Social Democrats and Greens, where both the party and its supporters would favor these two parties coming together, and with the FDP, because they have to get the parliamentary majority. And then you have the other option, the so-called Jamaica coalition with the Christian Democrats, the Liberals, where both party and supporters would prefer that coalition, and then you have to get the Greens on board to get that majority. And so the question is essentially, in my view, whether Social Democrats or Christian Democrats convince the other two parties, and which of the two smaller parties has more power over the other small party in the negotiations.
What are they going to have to offer each other? I mean,
well, they have to offer policy compromises and kind of argue with what can our voters bear and what can they not bear. The problem is FDP supporters don't like the Greens supporters don't like the FDP, they like it less than they dislike the CDU. So that's very difficult. Maybe the Greens have a slight upper hand, because we've discussed this, right? In 2017, we already had these Jamaica negotiations, right? And it was the FDP who quit and said it's not going to happen. And the Greens were portrayed as being very open to that. So I think none of them have any other options to negotiate, so can't say we're not going to strike a deal, go to somebody else. But I think there's a bit of more of a burden on the FDP now, especially in the public image, to now not kind of chicken out of the negotiations. And so maybe the Greens and the Social Democrats could use that to steer them into a traffic light coalition. That's going to be extremely difficult coalition negotiations.
Yeah, it really is. So for people asking how long it's going to take until we see the next German government, what is your guess?
Well, if we're lucky, Angela Merkel will not do the New Year's Eve address. If we're not lucky, she'll do it again, because we won't have a chancellor until then.
Okay, well, there is one more question I want to bring in from a viewer, Ayan, who's asking, can there be re-election if the parties cannot agree on forming a government?
Yeah, there could be re-elections, but this is something that's not really favored by anyone in Germany, the parties nor the public. I think a grand coalition, maybe redo of that, might be a bit more likely, because parties will fear a voter backlash for sending them back to the polls again. If they don't manage to find one of these coalitions, there will be mayor blame game going on. Who should be blamed by voters in these new elections?
Yeah.
German voters would prefer fresh elections, at least if you believe what they say in the polls. They would prefer fresh elections over minority government. So coming back to this love for stability.
Yeah. Okay, that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Arndt, for joining us here. And thanks to all of you on our stream as well for sending us those really great questions. It was good to catch up with you. And hopefully we were able to clear up a little bit more what happened in these German elections and what to expect going forward. So please stay in touch with us. And we hope to see you next time.